Somewhere underneath 9 years of guilt and 4 years of a love he hadn't had a name for until an hour ago. Some small and stubborn part of him had already, quietly, without his permission, begun deciding what he was going to do next. He didn't call her for 11 days after the cafe. The same number he'd note later as the longest silence they'd ever survived before, as though grief had its own arithmetic and kept insisting on the same figures. He spent those 11 days doing the only thing he knew how to do, with a truth too large to hold. He worked. He packed for a deployment. He filed 3 unrelated stories with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with the stories themselves and everything to do with needing his hands occupied. He read Elian Marek's name in every report he could find, searched archives he'd sworn off years earlier, and built, piece by piece, a fuller portrait of the man whose absence had somehow become the architecture of his own last 4 years, without his ever knowing it. On the 12th night, unable to sleep, unable to keep pretending that silence was a decision rather than a delay, he called her. She picked up on the second ring. "I didn't think you would," she said, and he could hear, underneath the careful calm she'd spent 4 years perfecting, something that had gone thin and unguarded with waiting. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I've spent 11 days trying to decide if there's a version of this where I get to keep you and still live with what I know. I don't think there is. I think I have to choose one." "And which one have you chosen?" "I don't know yet," he said. And it was the truest thing he'd said swear, in 4 years. I called because I couldn't stand not knowing what you sounded like, grieving something you'd already grieved once. I called because 11 days of silence taught me that I don't actually know how to live without your voice. And that terrifies me more than anything I learned in that cafe. The line held the kind of silence they'd once been experts in filling, back before either of them had a face to put to it. Nadia broke it first. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me get through it, because I've rehearsed it as many times as I rehearsed the cafe, and I still don't know if I have the courage for either version. Go ahead. Grief doesn't forgive, she said slowly, choosing each word the way a person chooses footing on ice. I used to think it did, that if I sat with it long enough, was patient enough, honest enough, it would eventually soften into something like peace, and I'd wake up one day and the weight would just be gone. It isn't like that. Grief doesn't forgive anybody, Sebastian. Not you, not me. For all the nights I let myself want a man I had every reason to hate. Not even Eliane for leaving, though I know that's not fair to him, and I've never said it out loud before tonight. Grief doesn't forgive. It just eventually agrees to sit beside you instead of on top of you. That's the whole of what 4 years taught me. That's the only mercy there is. Is that what this is for you? Something grief agreed to sit beside? No, she said, and her voice caught, finally, on something she'd been holding steady since the cafe. That's what frightens me most. You're not what grief allows me to survive. You're the thing I chose in spite of it. with my eyes open, knowing exactly what it would cost both of us if you ever found out. I don't get to call that an accident of healing. I have to call it what it is. I fell in love with you, Sebastian, fully understanding who you were and what road you'd walked. And I don't have a philosophy generous enough to make that sound like anything other than exactly what it is. Which is what? A betrayal, she said quietly, of him, of the version of myself that buried him. I've been telling myself for 4 years that love and grief could occupy the same house without one evicting the other. I don't actually believe that anymore. I think I let myself love you because some nights the loneliness was louder than the loyalty, and I have spent every day since telling myself that doesn't make me a bad person, and some nights I still don't believe it. Sebastian sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against his ear. The city outside his window, indifferent to everything being said inside it. I've spent 9 years, he said finally, telling myself that guilt was the only honest response to what happened on that road. That if I ever stopped feeling it, I'd be saying his death didn't matter. I think I was wrong about that too. I think guilt without a way forward isn't honesty. It's just another kind of hiding. One that lets you feel bad enough to avoid ever having to actually change anything. What would it mean to actually change something? I don't entirely know, he admitted. I know it doesn't mean pretending the road didn't happen. And I know it doesn't mean either of us performing enough suffering to earn forgiveness neither of us can actually give. You can't forgive me for Eliane, and I can't forgive you for loving me anyway. because neither of those deaths belong to us alone. They belong to him too, and he doesn't get a vote anymore. All we get to decide is what we do with what's left. That's the only real estate either of us has any claim to. I keep thinking about the version of you I built in my head before I ever heard you speak, Nadia said. The byline version. I hated him for a long time. Hated the calm, professional distance of that dispatch. The way it could describe a man's death in a single, clean paragraph and move on to the next fact. It took me 2 years of your voice in my ear to understand that the calm wasn't coldness. It was armor. You'd built a version of yourself that could survive filing that story only by refusing to feel it while you wrote it. I understand that now. I don't know if I understood it enough back then to forgive the byline, but I understand the man who wrote it far better than I understand most people I've known my whole life. I used to think that armor was the only responsible way to do the job, Sebastian said. That feeling everything in real time would make me useless. That a correspondent who cried at every checkpoint wouldn't last a single rotation. I still believe that a little, but I've started wondering these last 4 years whether the armor became the problem instead of the solution. Whether I kept it on so long after the war that I forgot how to feel anything at all until you gave me a place safe enough to take it off. Is that what I was? A place to take off your armor? You were the first place in 9 years, he said, where I didn't have to decide in advance what I was allowed to feel before I felt it. That's not a small thing, Nadia. That might be the largest thing anyone's ever given me. and I spent 4 years not knowing your last name. Nadia was quiet for a while, and when she spoke again, there was something new in her voice. Not resolution, not yet, but the shape of a person circling toward one. There's a thing I used to say to callers, she said, back before before any of this. I'd tell them that surviving grief doesn't mean the weight goes away. It means you get strong enough to carry it and still walk somewhere. I've said that sentence probably 1,000 times to 1,000 strangers, and I don't think I ever once believed it applied to me until right now, saying it to you. Where would you walk? Sebastian asked. If you let yourself. I don't know, she said. I've never let myself get that far in the thought before. Where would you? Toward you, he said, without hesitating, surprising himself with how little the answer had cost him to find. That's the only direction that's made sense in 4 years. I don't know how we carry what we're carrying and still choose that. I just know I don't want to walk anywhere that doesn't have your voice in it. And I've run out of interest in pretending guilt is a good enough reason to give that up. The line held another silence, gentler this time, less like a held breath and more like two people finally exhaling at the same moment. I leave in 3 days, Sebastian said eventually, for the deployment. I can't get out of it. I've tried. And Rena's right. It's the kind of assignment you don't turn down twice in a career. I don't know what I'm asking you for exactly. I don't think either of us has the right words yet for what this is supposed to become. I just know I don't want to get on that plane without telling you that whatever this costs, I choose it. I choose you, knowing everything now that I didn't know 4 years ago. That's the only thing I'm sure of. That's a very large thing to be sure of, Nadia said. 3 days before a war. It's the only kind of shore I have left. The rest of it, the road, the guilt, whether either of us deserve this. I don't think those questions have answers. I think we just have to decide whether we're willing to keep walking without them. They talked until the sky outside his window went black to the particular grey that precedes dawn in cities that never quite go dark. Not about the road this time. Not about Eliane, but about smaller things, the way they used to, before either of them knew what the other was carrying. A bakery, a book, the color a sky turns in the hour before something ends or begins. Neither of them certain anymore which this was. When they finally said good night, neither used the word goodbye, as though naming it might make it true before either of them was ready. On the second of the 3 days, Sebastian did something he hadn't done in 9 years. He visited the small memorial wall near the press office where the names of contacts, fixers, and soldiers known to correspondents were sometimes added informally, without ceremony, by whoever remembered to bring a plaque. He had walked past that wall 100 times without stopping. This time, he stood in front of it for the better part of an hour. And when he left, there was a small brass marker bearing a single line. Eliane Marek, remembered by those who owed him more than they ever said. He didn't tell Nadia he'd done it. He told himself that was because it didn't matter, that it changed nothing about the road or the guilt, or the 4 minutes a commander had spent deciding a route. but some part of him understood. It was the first time in 9 years he had done something for Eliane's memory that wasn't about managing his own guilt. The first gesture that had nothing to do with what he needed to feel better, and everything to do with a man who deserved, at minimum, to be named somewhere permanent by the person who'd helped choose the road that took him. The 3 days passed the way the worst and the best always do. Too fast to properly hold, too slow to survive without counting every hour. Nadia came to the airport, which she had never done for him before, because there had never before been a reason for her to have a face he could look for in a crowd. She stood near the security line, in a coat the color of the sky the morning they'd talked until dawn. And when he saw her, something in his chest loosened that had been tight since the checkpoint, since the road, since long before he'd ever known her name was real. "I don't have a speech," she said when he reached her. "I used up all my rehearsed words in that cafe. I only have this." "Then say it badly," he said. "I'd rather have it badly than not at all." "I love you," she said plainly, the words landing with none of the careful architecture she usually built around anything true. "I loved you before I had the right to, and I loved you after I learned I had every reason not to. And I don't think that's going to change, no matter what road you're standing on when you read this back to yourself in your head, which I know you will, because you narrate everything, even the things you're living through in real time. So come home." That's the whole speech. Come home so I have somewhere to send the rest of it. He kissed her then, for the first time, in the ordinary chaos of an airport that had no idea what it was witnessing, and it tasted like 4 years of a voice finally given a body, like grief and love occupying the same house after all, and simply, stubbornly refusing to let either one evict the other. "I'll call you the second I land," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be waiting. I'm always waiting. I told you that a long time ago, before either of us knew what it would cost." He boarded the plane with her voice still warm in his ear, and for the first time in 9 years, the road ahead of him didn't feel like something he was walking into alone. The call came 4 days later, not from him. Nadia was at her desk at the hotline when her phone rang, not the office line, but her own, the number only he had. She answered it, already smiling, already halfway to the sound of his voice, and the smile was still on her face for the half-second before Rena's voice replaced the one she'd been expecting. Careful and slow, in the particular register reserved for the worst kind of news, explaining that there had been an incident near the border, that details were still coming in, that they were doing everything they could to confirm. She sat very still in her chair for a long time after the call ended, the phone loose in her hand, staring at a wall she wasn't seeing, and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its total devastation, that she had built her entire life twice now around men who left for roads they didn't come back from, and that grief, true to its word, had never once promised her mercy. It had only ever promised to eventually sit beside her instead of on top of her. She picked up the hotline's other line an hour later because there was a stranger on it who needed a voice more than she needed her own silence, and she gave it to them the way she'd given it to Sebastian 4 years earlier, the way she would keep giving it. She understood now. For as long as there were strangers in the dark who needed someone willing to sit inside the silence with them and not ask it to be filled. Somewhere on a phone with no signal, in a country whose name made editors' voices tighten, Sebastian Reyes was, in fact, still alive, pinned down for 6 hours in a building that had taken fire meant for someone else, his own phone dead in his pocket, unable to call anyone at all, thinking in the long silence between one round of shelling and the next, not about the road, not about guilt, but about a woman in a coat the color of dawn, who had told him to come home so she'd have somewhere to send the rest of a sentence she'd started at an airport. He thought, too, in that silence, about the brass marker on the memorial wall, about the strange mathematics of grief that had led him from a locked room he'd spent 9 years walking past to a woman who had loved him anyway, to a country whose name still made his editor's voice tighten, to a building taking fire meant for someone else. He thought that if this was how it ended, pinned down, phone dead, unable to keep the one promise he'd made at an airport, then at least he had said the true thing before he left. At least she knew. Whatever else grief refused to offer either of them, it had not managed to take that away first. When the shelling finally stopped, and the silence that followed was the real kind, the kind that meant something rather than the kind that preceded words. Sebastian found his hands shaking too badly to dial for several minutes. He sat against a wall, still warm from impact, and thought about 11 days of silence once, 4 years ago, and how she'd told him she'd keep the line open the whole time. He understood now, in a way he hadn't fully understood then, exactly what that cost her. The not knowing stretched taut over hours that felt like years. Hope and dread occupying the same narrow space in the chest. His phone found signal an hour after the building went quiet. 41 missed calls, all from her. He did not know, in that silence, that 400 kilometers away, the woman he loved already believed him gone. She answered before the first ring finished, the way she'd answered his very first call 4 years earlier, without hesitation, without armor. A woman who had spent her whole adult life learning how to be the person on the other end of a phone for people in the worst moments of their lives, and who now, for the first time, was allowed to simply be the person receiving that call instead of giving it. "I'm here," Sebastian said, before she could speak, before either of them could say anything that might break under the weight of everything unsaid in the 4 hours between Rena's call and this one. "I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm here." She didn't say anything for a long moment. He could hear her breathing, ragged, and underneath it, something that might have been crying, or might have been the specific sound relief makes when it arrives too suddenly for the body to process cleanly. You said that to me once, she managed finally. The very first thing you ever said to me. Not those exact words, but I remember thinking that first night, I'm here, I'm always here, and thinking it was the strangest thing to say to a man who'd just told me nothing at all for 11 minutes. I didn't know yet that it would end up being the truest sentence either of us would ever say to each other. I meant it then, he said. I mean it more now. I have 4 minutes of a decision on a road that I will carry for the rest of my life. And I have 4 years of a voice that taught me how to carry it without it swallowing everything else I am. I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't think thank you is a large enough sentence for what you gave a stranger who called a hotline at 2 in the morning because he didn't know how else to survive his own silence. You don't have to thank me, she said. You just have to come home. That was always the whole of it. Everything else, the road, the guilt, whether either of us deserve this, none of it changes the only thing I actually need from you, which is the sound of your voice on the other end of a line telling me you're still there. I'm still there, he said. I'm still here, Nadia. I'm not going anywhere. Not the road, not the guilt, not anything is going to be large enough to take me away from the sound of you saying my name like that ever again. Outside, the city he was standing in was already beginning to slow. Unglamorous work of counting its dead and clearing its rubble, the way cities like that always did. Indifferent to the 2 people finding their way back to each other on a phone line that had already survived so much more than either of them had ever asked it to hold. Grief did not forgive either of them that night, and it would not forgive them the next night, or the one after that, or likely any night, for as long as they both lived. But it had, exactly as Nadia once promised 1,000 strangers in the dark, finally agreed to sit beside them instead of on top of them. And for two people who had spent 9 years and 4 years respectively learning to survive on far less mercy than that, it was at last enough. And somewhere between his silence and hers, a phone rang once more. His, this time, finally charged, finally in range, carrying into whatever came next. The only thing either of them had ever really had to offer each other from the start. A voice reaching across the dark, refusing against every reasonable argument grief could make to stop.